Okay, so hi and welcome. I'm Chris Jenkins. I'm one of the founders of Collective Intention. And Collective Intention is a DAO-backed community which we've set up to support the responsible development of the psychedelic therapy sector. As Collective Intention, we're focusing on areas that will impact on the goal of wide-ranging, equitable access to effective therapy. And that means from public awareness and acceptance to access to therapies and what can influence how effectively they deliver the most enduring benefit for people. And I'm here with David Cresci. Hello, David.
Hello.
From Media Forensics, who's a social media comms and crisis PR expert. I think that's right, but you can correct me when you do your little intro later if it's not. So Dave very kindly joined us for our launch event a couple of weeks back, where we got a 10-minute insight into your perspective on awareness and acceptance areas around psychedelic therapy. So this chat, as promised in that session, is part of a series of deeper dives we're doing into the focus areas with key actors and thought leaders. So David, thanks for joining us. So for those who haven't seen the launch event video, which is available on our Collective Intention YouTube channel, would you mind giving us a quick intro into your background? What's your interest and what brings you to this sector?
Sure, thanks, Chris. I started my, professional career in the late 90s at a public relations firm called Weber Shandwick, and I was there for 22 years. Starting in 99 all the way up to 2020, a lot changed in public relations. I started literally just doing press releases and calling the media, which was what public relations was for the 100 prior years. But then the web happened, and then social media happened, and so there were a lot of iterations of my career. But always my focus was on how technology impacts communication. So that brought me to 2014, 2015, 2016, when I began to see how social media was really disrupting communications overall, at least how communications was done traditionally. And I think we can all see now the impact of what social media is doing on our ability to convey facts and get real information out there to the world.
Yeah, for sure. We're definitely very much living in that.
Yeah, I mean, my inside joke is I was an advocate for social media, like die hard in the wool, like this is great, it's going to bring people together. All the stuff Zuckerberg still touts, unfortunately. And now I've got some weird guilt about, didn't turn out the way that I thought that it would. Yeah. So for the last 5 years, 6, 7, 8 years at my job there, I focused on crisis communications with an emphasis on social media. However, I got laid off in 2020 and then decided to start my own consultancy firm, Media Forensics, as you mentioned, and doing the crisis work that I'm talking about. But about 5 or 6 months ago, I decided to make a concerted effort to work within the psychedelic field. Okay. For a lot of reasons. Number one, I've got both personal history and family history with addiction, PTSD, anxiety, those kind of things. It's not hard to find anyone with, those kind of ailments, but there's some of that in my family. So therefore I have a, personal passion for it. I also was a proponent of, is that the gentle way of saying I love to do mushrooms and acid in my 20s.
Enthusiast is fine.
Okay, enthusiast. I graduated from college and I had a band, and my first foray into adulthood was trying to make it as a musician, which is not to say that everybody that's a musician is out there doing LSD and so forth, but it happened to be the case with me, especially the kind of music I was playing, and it was a great time. By which I mean I have experience with those compounds, so I know what it's like to be in that state. So that brings me, I haven't done LSD for 26 years, but you do it once and you don't forget that you've done it, right? So that at least brings me the when I'm talking to someone within this industry, I can relate to or understand what it's meant by you're an extremely vulnerable position, and all the serious elements that are part of that situation. And then lastly, and this is probably hard to understand if you don't work in PR, and every time I say it to somebody, I sound like I'm funny. It's a really fascinating communications environment. And if you are passionate and interested in the way that information flows throughout society and in our culture, it's really cool because there's a lot of audiences within this arena, far more like what I call key audiences, or what we call key audiences, than are in a normal communications campaign.
Okay.
And so that really tweaked my interest. Like, wow, we've got many groups that are trying to move the needle or move toward the same goal, whatever your metaphor is. But there are different motivations and sometimes conflicting motivations. And that really intrigued me. And while I was at the agency I used to be at, so for 22 years, if you ask me what my favorite account was, it was a very similar campaign working on the United States Census, where the challenge is get everyone in the US to understand the importance of why you should fill out the census.
So that's an interesting point. So you mentioned audiences, and I think we'll get onto that because that's really the meat of what we're going to talk about here. But and actually, there's another thing you mentioned there, which we'll probably come back to. Which something that I feel quite strongly about is this idea that there's people can recall or they've got a close association with the need that psychedelics are addressing. People in emotional distress for whom really we've not really seen much successful treatment. So we'll come on to that. But what I wanted to ask you first is, so you said it's from a kind of PR intellectualist perspective, and when you were talking about the census there, you're really talking about what are you talking about trying to sell? Is it a product or is it something else?
Yeah, no, it's an idea, right? It's a concept, or it's almost like you're trying to share a bit of knowledge. You're trying to tell the world why the United States citizens, why it's important, why the census matters.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about we do the census every 10 years. It wasn't the 2020 census I'm talking about. It was 2010. And why I'm saying that is because that's right when social media started to take off. So it was new. Which was the other reason why it was so fascinating, because this new thing called social media was suddenly both impeding and helping the effort, right? But
it can works for you, and again, it's just a tool which you can use powerfully in either direction, I guess.
Yeah, and there was a time, interestingly, that one of our key, most popular or most famous or infamous senators, depending on how you look at it, was critical of the census on Twitter, right? And in 2010, which was actually 29 at the time, because it was the run-up to the census, it was one of the most insane and bizarre things anyone had ever seen. Like, wait a minute, we have a United States senator criticizing another government body, the United States Census, and he's doing it on this weird thing called Twitter. What does that even mean? So that was fascinating. And I always loved the challenge of trying to get every demographic in the US to understand why this was important. And to me, this is a similar and even more complicated communications challenge. You're trying to communicate to virtually everyone a simple message of these are safe and this is what they can do to help, right? Yeah. And we're obviously in the early stages of clinical trials and research and so forth before we can come out with the data that we need to empirically say the things that we want to say. Yeah. But I at least am working on the assumption that that is going to be the case, right? That we will one day have enough data and evidence and research that we will be able to persuade regulators and legislators and be able to persuade pharma and be able to persuade the entities out there that need to be persuaded that this is safe and worth investing their money in, at which point the end goal is finally achieved, which is getting people the help they want, which is why, I mean, on the most core level of all, that's why I'm doing it. I myself suffered from significant abuse of alcohol for a period of time, not a terribly long time, but I think I concentrated it into 18 months of abject misery. Okay. And it's haunting, when I recall those kind of things that I experienced, and the thought of being able to contribute my professional experience toward even helping one person not experience that or get out of that trap feels really good. And
I think that would be a very similar story from a lot of people in the field. And I guess one of the things that we're trying to do from Collective Intention is go, well, for the people who are outside the science, I guess, who, you're saying that the key job is to build the evidence. And, even though some would say that, there's thousands of years of evidence, it just isn't in the Western scientific context. But, that's the world we live in now. So we have to update the evidence to do that. Although there's another argument set in the post-truth world who believes facts and evidence anymore, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. The other comparative comms challenge is vaccines and masks, right?
Yeah.
And it was of no surprise to me that was almost an utter failure in communication, at least in this country, where it didn't matter. I don't care who would have descended from the heavens to say, get a shot, take your vaccine. It wouldn't have mattered. So facts don't matter. Emotions and feelings matter. So how do you communicate that then, knowing that that's the case? And because that's a real concern I have. I just got done saying we're going to have the research and evidence that we need to move this forward.
Yeah.
Giant asterisk, footnote, whatever, except for the fact that a third of the country is not going to believe anything you say because it doesn't support their ideology.
Okay, because they don't. But do you think, so it's interesting at least from the psychedelics perspective, maybe if we can start talking about the audiences, that there's actually quite a broad coalition at the moment, at least, that seem to be in favor. A coalition of from well, what? In the sense that they wouldn't put themselves in together. But if you look at voices that are in favor, they cover a broad spectrum of at least political views. Yeah, and that's fascinating to me too. And I will admit, and this is certainly my own liberal bias, just to be candid about who you're listening to. That there are several people in the conservative side of the universe that are supportive of this. Yeah. And that surprised me. It made me happy in many ways because the idea of bipartisanship, at least in the US, is almost preposterous at this time. There's nothing we can do collectively. And then all of a sudden I'm seeing some of the most conservative politicians speak up in support of the potential of this treatment. And I've thought about that a lot. Like, how do we use that to move the ball forward when you've got a guy who everything else that he says is 100% against kind of the progressive mindset. But then, oh, by the way, I also support psychedelic treatments. If you look deeper, it makes sense because of the veteran aspect. The veterans in this country are, not taken care of under anyone's estimation. And so when you talk about perhaps helping veterans with PTSD and other things that they're suffering from, when they come back from war, it makes sense that the conservative side of this country at least supports that because they're very, very supportive of veterans. And then also the potential for saving millions and millions of dollars in healthcare. So when you put those two together, like, oh, now I get why Rick Perry in Texas, who literally doesn't think homosexuals, using his word, should drink alcohol for some bizarre reason, also happens to support this. But the problem is that because we're so polarized, if one side of the aisle, as we say, speaks up real loudly about a platform, then the other side almost knee-jerk reaction says, oh, I guess I don't like that. I don't know that that's going to happen, and I know it's really cynical, but it is at least something that I keep in the back of my mind, that I certainly am not going to persuade some people by saying, well, look what Rick Perry said. Yeah, but I suppose with a lot of this, it's about that. And I mean, we've talked quite a lot about this, obviously off camera. There's a lot of material, that can be used either way. But you need to have a group who for whatever reason want to kind of pick up that material and package it to support the alternative opinion, right? To sort of to push people away because, okay, Rick Perry supports it, but unless someone's going to weaponize that, I suppose, is whether that's the right terminology, it's probably not going to have a massive influence on people. I think you're right. It is who's going to do that and why. Yeah, and I think weaponization is the perfect word.
And I'm less concerned about, say, how do I say this? I don't know where all that's going to net out yet. That conservative versus progressive, or however you want to say it, maybe they will collectively come together and say, finally we are in concert on something.
Yeah.
But weaponization, which you asked if it's the right terminology, I think it is the perfect terminology. Like, that is my concern across the board of weaponization of content that's already out there, or situations that have happened, persons that are against this for whatever reason. There's already stuff out there that they could use as a weapon to knock it. And that's just the case with anything and everything, right?
Yeah, true. Yeah. You can have the motivation and the resources, I suppose.
Yeah.
To do it on a large enough scale, right?
Right. And, so if let's pretend, and I'm not saying this as a definitive truth, but let's pretend Big Pharma they were feeling threatened for whatever reason, because the solutions that this industry is putting forward undermine the idea of taking 2 pills a day for your depression for the rest of your life. Right.
Yeah.
And Big Pharma has billions of dollars at their disposal, and resources, and the sophistication to do whatever they want in marketing and social media and that kind of thing. And I'm saying that firsthand because I've worked within that industry for pharma clients while I was at the agency. And I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying I know how they work, and I know what kind of resources they have. So if they decide that they are feeling threatened, that's really the biggest threat, because they could weaponize anything and everything. They could take one story about a trauma session, a psychedelic session that went awry, and push that into the internet, and the damage would be just massive. So that's why I get real frustrated or freaked out when I see those things happening, and they need to be cared for carefully. Contrition, what are we going to do to change, that kind of thing, when these kind of couple negative episodes happen. Otherwise, they're just going to be, they're bullets for anyone who wants to use them. And that's just crisis PR 101, but the problem or the complexity is, and I've thought about this a lot, there's no head here. I can't go and tell the head of psychedelics, hey, you should really be careful with that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because when I think about, you made the case about it. I mean, actually, maybe we should, do you want to expand on that a little bit more in terms of the audiences?
Sure.
So, and then we can kind of return back and I can make the comparison.
Yeah. Thanks. So in the 5 or 6 months that I've doubled down, I guess, on trying to work within this industry, I've done a lot of reading, done a lot of IDIs, in-depth interviews with persons across the industry as I see it. So neuroscientists, bioethicists, marketers, investors, people who want this legalized so that they can do it recreationally. Like, this is what I mean by the broad spectrum of audiences. And so I've done a lot of interviews and a lot of reading, and I've taken a stab at identifying what I think are 9 audiences. Go ahead, Chris.
Before we get into that, sorry, I just realized we probably set a bit of context. So in terms of the context of those audiences, I mean, where are we at the moment? I mean, from someone like me, who I guess would be considered a psychedelic insider, you're someone who is kind of on the outside, but is moving a little bit to the inside. Things look pretty good, right? The FDA look like they're going to approve, or at least giving conditional approval to MDMA therapy, psilocybin therapy in the US, and there's a rising number of clinical trials. A number of states and jurisdictions, cities are looking to kind of deregulate or decriminalize. So the context, at least, looks positive, right? So where we are at the moment, if it continues on this trajectory and no one sticks up their hand and go, hang on a minute, we're in the wedding, and they say, has anyone here got any objections? Are we at that point? And no objections, right? Here we go, we're done. So, or are we somewhere else in the trajectory where, we've still got a long way to go before we get to the altar? And then,
I like your metaphor. We are definitely we are definitely in a really good place right now, and it's really exciting. And it's taken 50 years to recover from
Yes.
Richard M. Nixon's war on drugs that took away the research, as we all know. But I think we're in a different cultural place now, not just in this field, but you can see it. I mean, despite the difficulties and challenges that we have in this country and elsewhere, some social ideation has changed,
Yes.
and so the timing seems really good right now. It's not, we had cannabis that moved mountains in the last 10 or 15 years, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a good sign, and it opens the door for this next kind of understanding of that we don't necessarily need to fear these things. In fact, they could potentially help us. So we're in a great stage right now. Myself as a crisis guy, I'll just be blunt, like I tend to see the negative first.
Yeah, well, some people need to. It's about having a balanced approach, right?
So when I see something happening, my knee-jerk reaction is what can go wrong?
Yeah. So
kind of challenging to live that way, but as a PR guy, it's helpful because I can see around the corner and say, have you thought about this?
Yeah.
So I should get that out of the way, because I might appear, or am literally, like more cynical or more negative. But I think you're right. Like at least one voice like mine should be in the mix saying, this is great, but do not take your guard down.
No, we don't want groupthink, do we? You know what I mean? We don't want everyone thinking the same way. It's all going to be fine. And then suddenly bang,
Yeah. Yeah. And in all those conversations that I referenced a couple minutes ago, everyone is really enthusiastic, and it's fantastic and it's exciting.
Yeah.
But I have not yet, the one group that I've not yet spoken to, because it's been difficult for me to find them, is someone who is thinking about it from a communications perspective, like I'm talking about.
Okay.
So I'm not saying that I'm the voice of reason. That's obnoxious and arrogant, but I am just trying to throw in there, like, remember that big pharma may feel threatened. Yeah. They, at some point, they're going to be the key to it all and our biggest advocate, because they have the money that can really bring this to bear in a mass market sort of way. Or, yes, we've got certain psychedelic gurus out there that people on the inside love and will love to take pictures of at conventions and say, oh my gosh, I met this guy. He's like, he's like the Tim Leary of the 2020s. I'm like, that's great. But did you see what he said on a podcast last week?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. Okay, well, people who don't like this idea can use that now, right? And so I'm just here essentially to say, put on your seatbelt or carry the baby with both hands, like, because this is not, your enthusiasm is well-founded, not yours specifically, but the people that I've spoken with, is well-founded, and it's not, you have a reason to be excited and enthusiastic. And I'm just trying to make sure that excitement and enthusiasm gets to move forward as this stuff gets more legitimate. Because, when I talk to people outside of this world, normal people, and I don't, you know what I mean by that, like people who aren't thinking about this, they are not
heard of it.
Yeah, they're like, oh no, I hadn't heard of that. And then, which is kind of surprising, because literally in the last 2 or 3 months, there's been a huge uptick just in mainstream media articles writing about this industry. I'm like, this is really,
realize how few people actually
read the news.
You need to get it on Facebook.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this applies to everyone, but it's something I notice every time I get a new car. Every 5 years or whatever, you get this new car, and then suddenly you notice that everyone on the street has a car like yours. Not everyone, but like, oh, look, and that's only because your brain now has this car. And so you notice,
you see things, you're seeing things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's somewhat of what happens when you're within the industry. It appears like everyone knows about this and it's moving forward and it's great. And more importantly, that everybody loves it, to your point about groupthink.
Yeah. And actually it's an important point, because, part of what we're talking about here is we're trying to change the associations in people's memories, from the stigma that came from the war on drugs into something more, more positive and less fearful. And that idea of sort of salience and what comes to mind and noticing things is an important aspect of that, I guess. And the other thing we talk about big pharma, something that occurred to me yesterday actually when I was at a launch event for a European organization which is trying to sort of advance psychedelic therapies in Europe. And there was a lot of talk about, I mean, not a lot of talk, but there's discussion about the damage that alcohol does and how that a lot of the targets for the focuses of the therapies are, substance misuse or problem substance use. And so I guess from the kind of illegal drug perspective, maybe nobody's going to complain about it, but, cartels could pull some money together and start to fund a social media campaign. But definitely, I wonder about the alcohol and cigarette lobby. If these therapies look like they're highly effective at reducing people's consumption or eliminating their consumption of alcohol, they are some serious vested interests who may start to move to try and undermine what may be a threat to their business models.
That's about the darkest thought that I've heard in a week, right? Like you just leapt over my darkness and cynicism of seeing the crisis around the corner. Yeah, I mean, I think that's potentially a problem, but it would take such a covert sort of action on those two industries because.
Well, they've got form. At least the cigarette industry, the tobacco industry has got form, But maybe it's not big enough. Maybe it's not as powerful as the lobby that essentially is still holding back climate change.
Yeah, I hope that problem happens. You know what I mean? Because that means that it's matured enough so that they are. It's working. And at which point I really want to work on the PR campaign that combats that.
Okay.
That would be like my taking on Goliath,
So coming back to the audiences, I know I keep going off on sort of,
fine. It's how my
forays into other areas. Coming back to the audience, what did you find, or how did you kind of characterize the audiences that you?
So knowing that, anytime you are identifying audiences like this, you're making some real black and white statements, and you're categorizing people in a very general way. But so that caveat out there. But the way that I have identified it is the 9 audiences that I've said, and I don't have it in front of me, so I should have. See if I can do this off the top of my head. But we've got what I'm calling trippers or recreationalists, or the type of people that really that just love the drug and want to not worry about getting in trouble legally if they're taking it, right? They want to see it legalized recreationally.
Yeah.
And then you have what I call the wellness experts, or not the wellness experts, the wellness enthusiasts. So people that, excuse me, look for alternative ways to improve their mental and physical health. So just think like CBD gummies and that kind of stuff, that community. And
yeah, okay. So they're open to new ideas that will help them improve their motivation is, and they're open to, I guess they're also open to the influence of the natural environment and things. They can put things into their body and that will make them better.
Yeah, exactly. And they're open and willing enough to try new things without necessarily needing the CDC or some government body to say, yes, this is categorically safe. They're a little higher on the risk-taking end, right?
Yeah.
And I should have started this statement by saying this is a political campaign in my mind of selling an idea, like we discussed. Anytime you're doing a political campaign, or any campaign, frankly, but especially in politics, it is a simple formula of ignore the people that will never change, because it's a waste of resources. Don't irritate or upset your base. And focus all your resources on what we call the movable middle. And that's not me. That's PR speak.
Yeah, I mean, we have a concept in this country, and we may well have the same, which is kind of swing voter.
Yeah, it's exactly.
They quite often characterize them with catchy titles like, it wouldn't mean much to you, but Morrison's Man or Waitrose Woman, which are kind of these are the supermarkets they shop at, or just some sort of terminology to try and encapsulate, what a lifestyle and a way of thinking and some values that they've got.
Exactly. So the two of the 9 that I'm talking about there, the trippers and the wellness enthusiasts, are obviously part of the base. We don't need to convince them because they're already convinced. What makes it tricky in this instance, unlike most campaigns that I've ever worked on, is that especially the trippers can kind of alienate or push people, the swing voters or the movable middle, away because they're real cash about mental health and safety from the perspective of somebody who doesn't think that way, who isn't a risk taker.
Yeah, so they still keep this. So they're the people who reinforce the association of the war on drugs, kind of, I guess. That
they evoke
triggers that a certain emotional response in a certain group of people in your movable middle.
I mean, the simplest way to say it is, still to this day, but certainly when Nixon was doing his thing, when you would watch the nightly news, they would talk about this crazy drug LSD, and then almost every time, quick snapshot to Woodstock with crazy people in the mud doing crazy things.
Yeah.
And there's an association there, right? Like, if you take LSD, you become that crazy person. Yeah. And if you watch the Woodstock movie, it's fantastic in that when they're interviewing the people in the town, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but it says it all. They interview people in the town about all these crazy hippies coming into town, and they're of course these very, like, straight laced, like, and it's like the town was infested with alien rats,
Yeah.
So it's the same idea, like that same association, or it just feels the same, and it can be used against them. So my point is, like, I never want, like, I would love it if these drugs were legalized for recreation.
Yeah.
Because I believe that most of them are not harmful. But that's not where I'm putting my energy. But I also just leave those people alone. You can't use them to reinforce the points about psychedelic therapy for mental illness. That's what I'm failing to get to quickly. And I use my mom all the time as the movable middle in my head, because she's someone with past trauma and PTSD and anxiety.
So she's movable middle in the sense that someone who we want to reach because they would benefit.
In 2 ways. Number one, she would benefit, but number 2, she's also open-minded enough to not categorically shut down the idea.
Yeah, okay.
She's also not persuaded yet, though, right? Because I mean, think about it. She was in her 30s when the Nixon thing was happening. I was 2. So she's even more impacted by that cultural misperception that was forged at the time. Yeah, but she is real liberal and would be willing. But I could never, some of the tweets that I see in TikTok and so forth of what I'm calling the trippers. I could never use that to try to persuade my mom that this was safe, because it's like, dude, I was just tripping on the bus and this guy was wearing an orange hat and I couldn't get it out of my mind for 30 minutes and I thought it was talking to me. Like, fine. Yeah. But that's not helpful to what you and I are trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
But then you have another set of people, like the scientists and the actual mental health therapists are 2 obviously key important audiences. The mental health therapists need to be on board so that they can recommend to their patients that this might be a viable treatment. And obviously the science behind it is everything that we need. But here comes the paradox of the whole situation. The scientists need more money to do the research.
Yeah.
They get that in part from investors and from donors. But the investors and the donors need the reassurance that this is viable. But so it's a chicken or the egg. Like, well, the scientists need the money and the money people need the science, right? You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I understand that. And it's interesting, I guess, because there is an overlap. You know, mental health experts and scientists, they overlap because you've got psychiatry kind of crossing over those two barriers, and the psychologists would consider them scientists as well. But I guess you're talking more. I'm research scientists.
Yeah. So those are like four more of the audiences, but it's really, to me, the heart of the paradox of how do we get the money that we're needed? How do we convince the people that are willing to invest and or give the money before the science is as legit as they want it to be in order to give the money?
Yeah, I mean, and just to throw some data in here, the scientists, I mean, from those groups, they did a survey in the UK, 59% of people from the general population said they would consider psilocybin for, a mental health disorder if there was evidence and they were suffering from that. I mean, that's probably, or definitely would consider, and that's consider as well. So that's not take. And, so it shows that, that middle is kind of soft and ready to be persuaded to continue on the same.
And that's a big middle
track. But you still, and that's a big middle. Even the scientists, when we look at psychologists and counselors, around 70 to 80% of them think that research should continue and be funded, and they also broadly support that it's got therapeutic potential. So, it continues, I guess, to look good in that sense. So, but who do you think then are the key audiences? And I should say that I think you've got sort of an essay or an article coming out on this, where people can actually, they'll be able to look at your representation.
Yeah, hopefully it'll make a little more sense than my rambling here.
See your arguments. See the arguments you're making, and I think you go through and explain the audiences in a little more detail. So who are the key audiences? Are you just really thinking the movable middle, or are the other ones who are kind of?
Well, it depends on what you mean by audience. When I'm talking about audience, I'm talking about who are the audiences that will move that middle, right?
Right. Okay.
Who are the audiences that are going to get
influences?
Yep. That's another word. And I mean, technically I use stakeholders more than audiences. These are words that. So
these are the people that are in the game. They have a stake, they're playing a role. And then outside of that, or in the middle, I guess, are the consumers. Right?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. And so when I point out the trippers and the wellness enthusiasts, I'm not saying that they are audiences that are going to help move us forward. I'm saying we need to make sure that their enthusiasm doesn't move us backwards.
Yeah.
And I'm just pointing that out. So to me, the most important, I guess, would be three. It's legislators, it's the science behind it, and it's the money behind it. And those three are like one animal chasing its tail, if you will, because the scientists, like I said before, the scientists need money. The legislators need to pass the laws in order to make this legal so that the research can be done, so that the people with the money are willing to invest. And it goes around and around and around in a circle. And at the bottom of all of that, because of the way that legislation often works with constituents, you need generally people's consensus. And the data that you just conveyed, 59% of people are willing to consider, that's really, really great. Because then a lawmaker isn't saying, well, if I vote for this or I support this, am I going to terrorize my constituents? Probably not. Especially because of the both sides of the political spectrum that we've already suggested is more broad than in almost any other field, right? That, those are the three key audiences insofar as moving the ball forward, but it's really about making sure that we get general consensus from people in order to kick off the whole thing. And that's why I'm so sensitive to when negative stories come out that should never have happened or are handled poorly once they do come out, because that scars people's impression on what's happening. And I wish I were a social psychologist so I could speak more intelligently about it, but because there is already a culture, at least in this country, of negativity about it there's a stigma, to use the obvious word, like that people might not even be aware of. They might not even, millions of people have not even thought about psilocybin for a decade or their lifetime. But when presented to them, they're like, oh yeah, don't people jump off buildings when they take LSD? You know, I don't know why I think that, but I think that.
Yeah, it's a concept in psychology called the availability bias. So it's, you know, how easily do you recall, you know, certain instances, and what do they bring to mind, you know, and what's emotionally associated with it, you know, and that stigma is kind of latent. And at the moment, you know, we've topped it up with kind of top of mind articles, positive coverage, but that you know, those negative associations, they're deep and they're emotional, if that makes sense. Whereas the other ones that we've got is a kind of informational, so we can recall. So it's about wanting to replace it.
And we both know which is more powerful, the intellectual data side or the emotion side.
And so there was a couple of things that I wanted to cover on that. So one, we kind of touched on it earlier. So within the stakeholder, the kind of the key audiences, you've got the regulators and the money men, but you've also got what we consider the conservatives. And I suppose if I was drawing a Venn diagram, you would definitely draw some significant overlap between the regulators, or at least the people who control the regulators, and the money men and the conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting to me is that, at least, you know, you could probably give examples. Rick Perry, you gave example. We've also seen on Fox News, people are pro. But if you look at the people who are actually doing the therapy and their aims, you know, the people who are running the companies and their aims, they're very much about social awareness, fairness. You know, they talk about intergenerational trauma, you know, essentially acknowledging the damage, you know, that slavery did, and that they're essentially accepting that, you know, America and most of the Western world has been, you know, racist societies, which has seriously impacted on people's lives. And there's even an awareness that actually being, you know, if you're Black and you live in a society like this, that in itself is traumatic, because when you leave the house, you have a different experience of safety than someone who is, you know, very luckily like me, you know, I'm a white middle class male living in, you know, I walk out the door and I have no fear that the police are going to stop me.
Yeah.
But yet that is, and so I wonder at what point the conservatives will realise that, well, actually, this might change people's minds and open their minds and make them not feel the same way we feel. And just, that's one thing that sort of I find curious, and I just wonder where.
Well, I think we could go back to Nixon, right? One of the reasons why he didn't like them smoking pot and taking acid is because that made them question the government and an authority.
Yeah, and not want to fight or, you know, support the.
Right. And that, so I think you can apply that today. And I mean, in this country, what you just brought up is one of the most incendiary things that are burning in this country, which is, you know, critical race theory. And we're banning books that, you know, make white kids feel bad that slavery existed, and totally distorting what critical race theory is trying to convey, which is, are you aware of what the implications are of what has happened? Like, and the ignorance of saying, like, slavery hasn't existed for hundreds of years. What's the problem, young Black person? Like, I'm sorry, it's more complicated than that, right? So I don't know if that type of therapy, if this type of therapy were diving into that and moving that discussion forward, it'd of course be fantastic. But I don't know how the white evangelicals who are trying to hold on to power on their dying breath here in this country would react to that, because it's a dramatic, apparently from what all of their actions suggest, it's a dramatic threat to them. Like, to me.
It's almost as if there's some latent guilt, you know, that they're trying to assuage.
It's so latent
to close the cognitive dissonance gap. You know, I am a good person, but I let all this horrible stuff go on under my name, you know. But if I fund psychedelic therapy, then they'll all get happy. But maybe they're more confident than
it's opening Pandora's box that they don't want opened, you know.
And that seems a bit strange. Seems a bit strange to me, but I guess there is a strand that it's about, you know, freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, And, and as we saw on the storming of the Capitol, Mr. Man, psychedelic shaman with the horns was right up there storming the Capitol. So, there's no guarantee, not that I would necessarily want it, that it engenders a particular, political view. It might just reinforce, a more sort of more confidence in your own image. And we've had plenty of stories of people believing, taking too much acid.
Yeah, who knows?
Jesus, that idea of narcissistic developments from therapy is or from psychedelic use is there are plenty of examples of that.
Right.
So we wandered a bit off thread there, but so just some other things I wanted to touch on. So we mentioned this idea of sort of psychedelics and the legacy that it has. What's your view on language and how, whether the word psychedelic should be used? There's been some attempts to develop different terminology, or whether it's a useful way to throw in loads of complicated ideas that people can simplify, because most brains like simplification. Complexity takes effort, and we tend to go for simplification if we can do.
It confuses us.
It's hard.
Boy, that's a big topic. And as a PR person and as an English major and lover of language, words really matter to me, and they matter to everyone. But a better way to say it is that I think a lot about specific words.
Okay.
Every word in crisis communications matters. For example, like something negative happens, you got to be really careful with every verb, adjective, pronoun, everything, because people that are inherently against you can pick up on those and twist your words and distort them against you. So in this particular case, for example, I'll just start with magic mushrooms. When I first started getting into this research, and I'm seeing that almost every media outlet is saying magic mushrooms in the headline, and I understand from a journalistic perspective why that is, because it's almost like clickbait. It draws people in.
Yeah.
It's alliterative. It's cool. We all think about, I don't know, Mario Brothers or something. But my problem with it is back to my mom. I'm like, hey, Mom, you're suffering some really awful mental health issues. You want to try some magic mushrooms? Like, that's not viable to the severity of her condition, right? It's not going to like, oh yeah, I'd never thought about magic. And while internally, within the base calling them magic mushrooms, that's fine, absolutely fine. But when we are trying to persuade that movable middle, I wish that we would avoid terms like that and psychonaut, and because they don't give the confidence to the movable middle that they're looking for. We need to be more, I don't know, less like that Woodstock video that I was talking about, right? Yeah. So that's magic mushrooms. What I'm more concerned about is kind of I think illustrative of the overall communications problem. So I hope I get this. I hope I say this right. But when you think about psychedelics, I wish, yes, that we had a different term. We don't, that I can find. People try to throw them out there. But my problem with it is when you say psychedelics, oh, what do you mean? Oh, like psilocybin and LSD and MDMA and peyote. That sounds fine to a journalist who's writing the story. That sounds fine to most people. A neuroscientist sees that and says, MDMA is not the same kind of compound as the other three that you just mentioned. It's neurotoxic, for starters. It works on a different receptor.
Yeah. So
we, to them, look ignorant, right? So carry this story all the way through how we're trying to move the ball forward. You get a lobbyist that goes, talks to a congressperson that says, look at these results about psychedelics. 59% of the people would like to consider it. Here's some research from Johns Hopkins or NYU that shows that 40% of the people, great stuff. And then, so what are you talking about? Well, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD. Cool, says the congressperson. The meeting's over. The congressperson does his due diligence and starts talking to scientists and says, not MDMA. And I'm not advocating for or against MDMA. I'm just saying that congressperson now says, this guy just told me that these drugs weren't neurotoxic, or whatever word he or she used. Now, do I trust that lobbyist anymore? Because are they either ignorant or are they trying to pull the wool over my eyes?
Yeah.
Because MDMA has shown great results. And just because it's neurotoxic does not mean that 1 or 2 doses of it is a bad idea. Plenty of drugs we take are neurotoxic. So I'm not all concerned about its neurotoxicity. I'm concerned that we are using language that lumps things in together that are not the same, that might get by most of our audiences, but we need the scientists to support us as well. And if we look ignorant or like we're trying to obfuscate, and it undermines our credibility, and then that congressperson or, you know, a donor might like, oh, I was told that these drugs are harmless, and then my friend just told me MDMA is not harmless.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Whether the, you know, the association simplification ends up undermining the whole case.
Yeah, and it's really too late then if that congressperson calls the lobbyist and says, hey, and he's like, oh yeah, you know, just for simplification, it's more nuanced than what I was saying. And like, well, we're talking about people's mental health and lives here. We need the nuance.
Yeah, and I suppose that's why, in a way, that there's a sort of, you know, an association of a molecule with a particular condition. So when we talk to the general public about the, you know, this kind of wave, because it's the thing about this whole sector movement, whatever the terminology, is a paradigm shift in so many ways that it changes. It's not just, you know, you're not talking about we're going to give you a drug. We're saying we're going to give you something and you're going to have to go into therapy. And it's actually not the drug on itself. It's the, you know, it's the molecule plus the therapy. It just enables an experience, and you have to have the concepts of neuroplasticity. And there's so many new concepts that need to be introduced.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking about moving away from the disorder model of psychiatry. So we won't necessarily be diagnosing disorders. We'll be looking at the root and what's causing the disorder. We're talking about moving away from the pharma model. We're talking about moving away from the pills and the treatment model. It challenges the Western medical model because it's talking about, well, actually maybe trauma still in the body. So all this stuff that the, you know, the Eastern practitioners were doing, that actually has validity, and that's why I think the psychedelics label is useful, because it can be used to encapsulate all of those things in one, whereas exactly scientifically it's completely inaccurate, you know. And obviously what do we even do with ketamine as well? You know, ketamine is not only is it toxic and it can give you bladder damage, it's also addictive, you know. But that's the only one that's actually legal to prescribe, right? So
and isn't that the most ironic thing in the history of drugs?
But it's about being, and I guess it's just a drug which can allow you to think differently about yourself, your life.
It's disassociative, right? And I understand why some people kind of throw it in there, you know. But I agree 100%, and it points to the challenge that I look at and feel qualified. Like this is what's fascinating also about this. Like, I'm so unqualified to talk about this stuff from a scientific level, from a social psychology level, right? I can only talk about messaging in a way that I feel confident of putting the idea forward. And I'm still like, I don't know, this is a crazy time, and it's a crazy industry.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, and this is the core thing that I think, and I do think that this movable middle are more robust than we think they are, and I think that's because, and this is why it attracts, you know, because everyone knows someone, either themselves or their family, and they've seen someone suffer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they've seen that, and they've seen that the help available it doesn't really help them. You know, and so everyone has that in their mind, and they can recall that, and so they've got. So if we attach the psychedelics to the need, then that then people go, right, okay, well that helps.
Yep,
myself.
And that's because it's an emotional argument, and
exactly, and it's so powerful emotion because we I think in ourselves, we all really, even though we, the human brain is great at, building a kind of coherent narrative, we all know that we could go there, particularly if what happened to those people most often happened to us. Yeah. So it kind of plays to our internal feelings of our own fragility and vulnerability. And if it's attractive because we think, well, that gives me some potential safety and healing. That, at least that's my perspective. But like you, I'm also a cynic and someone who can see problems, and I know I've seen how public opinion can be swayed if a particular group of people have enough resources and enough dedication to try and influence and sway them, and enough disregard for the truth, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, but I think that was a great explanation of the actual paradox here, is that we need to use emotions to convey data,
Yeah, basically
because if it's pure data, no one listens. And if it's only emotions, then it just sounds like, you
need to give data to allow people to back up why they feel the way they feel. And those are the two things that we need to do. So we kind of, I mean, I could continue this forever, but probably need to keep it to around an hour. But before we wrap up, what do you think? So one of the things that collective intention is trying to do, as well as obviously gather, information, opinion, is to think about what actions or activities, could be undertaken. So, if you were to think about, a project or some useful exercise that could be undertaken that would have value, what would you consider would be worthwhile doing? A data collection exercise or modeling exercise or anything like that?
Yeah, the audience research that I've done was done only by me.
Yeah.
And it was done without the sophisticated and tools and resources that, for example, the agency I used to be with, or any agency, frankly, has.
Yeah.
So when you're right, I'm going to be posting something on Monday about all of this, but I'm quick to say this is a hypothesis because these are my impressions and observations from all these calls and my manual research. More needs to be done to
test those hypotheses.
Like, how close am I? I don't know, but no one else that I've seen is doing it, and we got to start somewhere. So I'm just trying to kickstart the engine here, hoping that I can work with somebody that does have those resources and tools to be able to help define those audiences so that we can collectively move forward and conduct all of the communications that go out in a way that is consistent across the board. Back to my point about there's no boss here. I don't have a client here because there's no head of psychedelics. So that's going to be a challenge. But if I can get to the point where, this is legitimate research that's done in the way that I just said, then we can, hopefully start sharing that to all of the parties involved, the investors, the donors, the scientists, the veterans, the lobbyists, so that we are, as best as possible, all speaking the same language. And that's just, again, PR 101, as I keep saying, like, consistency in messaging is the most important thing in any communications campaign, whether it's crisis or otherwise. The challenge is, this is not a body. This is a collection, of entities with different motivations, different ideologies. So it's going to be a challenge, but I'm trying. And I think we should all try to pay attention. And, I am so impressed by the cannabis industry and what they've done. And, I should have thrown this out there when I was talking about magic mushrooms, but, they don't say pot, they don't say high, they don't say weed. Someone along the line figured out, like, we need to say CBD and THC and cannabis, because for whatever reason, that sounds more legit. And, for obvious reasons, I guess it once again gets away from the Woodstock imagery.
Yeah, it doesn't have the association.
I should probably stop talking about Woodstock because that dates me so much, and most people.
Yeah, and I suppose the other things, we don't know what the different target patient populations think about the, therapies, what their concerns are, what would stop them taking it, coming forward, and what would prevent that. We also don't know, what different subsections of the population, we touched earlier on critical race theory, what can we do to influence people who may have very valid reasons to question the motives of scientists and other things, to make sure you get take-up. How can we reach beyond people like you and me into populations that actually need them, more potentially. So these are, I guess, these would be other areas that are really worth kind of trying to look into, and maybe there are things that we'll return to in future sessions.
Like anything else, you're asking what I want more research.
Yeah, same.
What you just said is just so vital. Like what's stopping you from, well, first of all, you're 59% considering. Like a lot of people are not going to want to appear to be so set in their ways. Like, I would never consider that. Right.
Yeah,
So we need to understand why you're not saying I would take that, I would try that.
Yeah.
And, the vaccine model is helpful in that, of course, there's a certain population that immediately ran out to get the vaccine. And then there's the population that will never take it. But there's the population, the movable middle, that like, I want to watch to see how this plays out. If people start dropping dead by the thousands because, we hurried this vaccine through, and obviously that didn't happen and more people are taking it. But I suspect that it will be similar here. Like there are people that will jump in and get the therapy once it's legal. And I'm quite confident that the results will be great. And that will start to move the middle because they are seeing the reinforcement. Like the data is fine, whatever. But until I start hearing about it, it's not meaningful to me. And then I would perceive it to be my goal is to make sure that doesn't get disrupted by hostile entities that want to take it down, or accidents and mistakes from my crisis world that will unnecessarily disrupt the progress that is happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, like I said, there's so much more we could do into these subjects and deep dives, but thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And as I mentioned before, this is a series of deep dives we're doing. We want to look into each of these areas as much as we can, try and understand, what's the situation now, what might need to be done, and try and work out, a plan of action, or even create some useful tools or information for people to use. So as we move forward, we can kind of build a library of experience. So if you're interested in hearing more, and we'll be having some events, please do sign up at collectiveintention.io to our mailing list, and we'll keep you up to date with anything we're doing. So thanks again, David.
Thanks, Chris.
Have a good day.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.